Now, over the years, Christians have used several different approaches to spiritual formation, and I like to think of these as being the streams mentioned in Psalm 46. Going back to our reading, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The verse is a reference to the river found in the Garden of Eden, as described in the book of Genesis. As an image, it is used in Psalm 46 and elsewhere in the Bible to represent restoration. Be restored to our Creator, be restored in who we were meant to be. You see, the wholeness that humanity once had in the Garden of Eden, but subsequently lost, can be regained through faith in Jesus Christ. Experiencing the river of life is yet another way to describe the restoration we call spiritual formation. And so, just as in ordinary geography, streams that flow into a river make it stronger, so too these different streams of spirituality can strengthen our experience of the river of life, of becoming more and more like Christ. Now, in order to introduce you to these different traditions, these different approaches, I'm going to borrow somewhat heavily from Richard Foster's book called Living Streams. Streams of living water, in which he describes 6 major traditions of spirituality. And by the way, it's a book I recommend. We're only going to just touch the surface today. Now, I'm not expecting you to remember all these names after we're done. And there's not going to be a quiz before you can leave the building or anything like that. I have listed the names of the categories in the bulletin, the bookmark portion of your worship programs. But I at least want you to become familiar with these different traditions. My aim is threefold. First of all, to free you from the notion that there's only one way to approach Christian spirituality. 2, to encourage you to broaden your practice of spiritual disciplines. And 3, I want to promote solidarity with all the different kinds of people who call upon Jesus Christ as their Lord. Now, a few caveats before we get into the actual categories. The 6 traditions do not represent 6 different denominations. So you can't go down the list and say, well, that's this church and that's that church. It doesn't work that way. For example, the Presbyterian Church USA is a denomination, but all 6 approaches of spirituality can be found within the one denomination. There are Presbyterians that practice some or all of these traditions. Nor does the tradition necessarily represent a particular movement in history. And this is where it may get a little confusing. So, for example, the holiness movement, the movement started in the 18th century and includes such denominations as the Church of God and the Church of the Nazarene. Okay? That's different from the holiness tradition, which predates the movement, includes it, of course, but predates it, and can be found in many other denominations as well. And along those same lines, well-known people from history do not necessarily just fit into one category. And so John Wesley, I'm looking at our director of music for the Methodist. John Wesley Can be placed in the holiness tradition, but he could also be placed in the evangelical tradition. He fits in more than one category, and there are a lot of people like that. Now, I also have to say that each of these traditions has had its share of extremists, wackos. Saint Fintua was an Irish contemplative, and he voluntarily spent 7 years suspended by iron shackles under his armpits. I don't know why, but he thought that was a cool thing to do. And then there was Simeon, the Stylite, who spent 39 years on top of a 60-foot column. He said, in order to get away from people who kept asking him for advice on prayer. 39 years. And then there was an abbess from the 7th century called It, and she would gather up beetles, carnivorous beetles, and place them on her skin for the sole purpose of having the beetles eat away at her flesh. She thought this was a spiritual practice. So, we're naturally appalled by such extremism. But are we any different in our world today? It may not be a spiritual discipline, but there are other things over which people are obsessed, like having a youthful body. Think of people whose entire lives revolve around the quest for buns of steel. Okay? This is wacko stuff. My point is, let's not judge each of these spiritual traditions by a handful of wackos. Okay, moving on then. The first stream is the contemplative stream. A contemplative is one who wants to contemplate or meditate on the love of God. The focus is on learning how to live a prayer-filled life. A biblical representative would be Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who wanted to be with and listen to Jesus more than anything